Guys, welcome to the channel. Thank you for subscribing and for sharing, the notification bell, all of that stuff. Look, we are going to be interacting with Robert Lawrence Kuhn from Closer to Truth. If you haven't been following the Closer to Truth series, he's been doing this since he was 8 and he is now 85. So, I mean, this is ongoing. Shout out to Lawrence Kuhn. I'm just kidding. I think he has a background in neuroscience, something of this nature. He's asking the question, how free is God? So let's see what he has to say, and let's see who he's interviewing and get into it.
I begin with a leading philosopher of religion who argues that God's attributes are coherent, Richard Swinburne.
God's attributes are coherent. I wonder if that means that God is fully knowable to the human.
Why does Richard claim that God's freedom is one of God's primary attributes? Richard, what does it mean for God to be perfectly free?
Means for him not to have any irrational causes acting on him. When we make a choice, shall I eat the cream cake or not? I think it's a bad thing to eat the cream cake, but I feel an inclination, an irrational inclination to do so.
And by irrational, he just means it's not the rational portion of the tripart self. Maybe he's using that Platonic three persons where it's like you have the biological self that wants pleasure instead of pain, and then there's the cultural self that wants pride instead of shame. Those aren't necessarily rational. They're just inclinations. It's almost like a punishment reward system. But then there's the rational self that wants the truth instead of the lie. And so what Richard might be saying is that God is purely rational, that there are no biological or cultural urges, which are always going to have a part to play in our decision-making. So our decision-making is very rarely, if ever, purely rational. We have forces acting upon us that will either lead us in the right direction. Sometimes our biological self can be tyrannical over our rational selves, which is why you would eat the cake instead of going to the gym, for instance. So interesting idea. I don't know if I share this idea, but I'm willing to be convinced. Let's keep going.
And more generally, we're subjugation.
I'm going to rewind it just a little bit.
Is acting on him. When we make a choice, shall I eat the cream cake or not? I think it's a bad thing to eat the cream cake, but I feel an inclination, an irrational inclination to do so. And more generally, we're subject to inclinations to eat too much, drink too much, sleep too much, etc., etc. God is not subject to any such inclination. He sees the moral quality of things, good or bad, as the case may be, and is influenced solely by that.
So he says that God is influenced by what is good or bad. And, you know, so it's kind of saying that there is a goodness that God perceives and that God kind of lives up to the standard of this goodness that he notices. Where I think, someone like William Lane Craig or, other apologists would say that goodness just proceeds forth from the character of God kind of as a matter of course. So, I mean, I wonder if Lawrence Kuhn is going to question him on that and say, well, is God submitting to this law which is above him? I'm not familiar with the relevant details there. Let's keep going.
Quality of things, good or bad, as the case may be, and is influenced solely by that. And therefore, he is always going to do what is good. But of course, there are enormous numbers of things that are good. Very seldom, I think, is there one best action in a situation for any one of us sometimes to do, but certainly for God to do.
And this is where it gets confusing to me. It's like, what is a good action for God to do? If God is the only standalone being in existence, and we emerged out of his nature or we were created to do his bidding, that's kind of what gets in the way for me on a philosophical level of what God actually ought to be doing, right? Is there any way to say that God should or shouldn't do anything? I guess it would make sense if you say that there is some moral law that God is ultimately submitting to, which it seems like Swinburne is wanting to say. But then how do you justify the existence of some moral law that exists even above God himself? I don't know. It's for this reason that I don't see God as an agent. Because I mean, it gets into really, really murky waters, and maybe a little bit above my pay grade. Let's keep going.
Is going to do what is good. But of course, there are enormous numbers of things that are good. Very seldom, I think, is there one best action in a situation for any one of us sometimes to do, but certainly for God to do. Sometimes the choice before God will be between several equal best actions, but very often I think the choice before God is an infinite number of actions, each of which is better than the last, such that whatever he does, he could have done better. Obvious example, how many human beings shall he create, assuming human beings are a good thing? Any number he creates will be less than some number which he could create, and the same applies even if he makes an infinite number.
You see how he's getting into the weeds here? And maybe, I mean, his brain, he's clearly an intellectual titan. He can handle all of this stuff. But it's like, I think Swinburne wants to imagine that God is the greatest conceivable being. And the greatest conceivable being can't possibly make 5 million people if 6 million people would be better, right? If I can imagine a greater being, then it's not the greatest conceivable being by definition. And so it's for this reason that I tend to leave words like good and evil, like the comparative terms, to the human beings. I'm a constructivist. I guess that means that human beings create terms like good and evil, but God is the superlative that makes sense of those comparative terms. Something like that.
He creates, assuming human beings are a good thing. Any number he creates will be less than some number which he could create, and the same applies even if he makes an infinite number. So in that situation, what does perfect goodness amount to? Well, perfect goodness will involve doing the best when there is a best, doing one of the equal best when there is a best, and simply otherwise doing good actions. That's all that is logically possible for a being who is a good being, as good as a being can be. A being can be as good as a being can be, even if the actions he does are not always the best, because often there isn't a best.
The freedom.
Guys, if you have any ability to paraphrase that last statement, please correspond with me in the comments and give here's the competition in the comments, if you're willing to accept it. Give a simplified understanding of what Swinburne is trying to say. Make it a syllogism if you can.
Are not always the best, because often there isn't a best.
The freedom that God has to do this, is that constrained in any way at any one moment? For example, by previous acts that God did, does that put a limit on future acts?
Sometimes, yes. If God makes a promise, he will fulfill it. That's a moral limit on his future actions, and there are obvious logical limits. That's to say, if he brings about the First World War, then he can't later bring it about that another war is the First World War.
Well, I mean, why would God prefer classical logic over paraconsistent logic? I mean, there are logicians such as J. Garfield, for instance. If you look at J. Garfield versus Bernardo Kastrup, J. Garfield is utilizing this paraconsistent logic, and Bernardo is utilizing more of a classical logic, even though he doesn't necessarily believe in the law of the excluded middle. Why would we suggest that God has to abide by our epistemological axioms, right? I mean, human beings might see logic in a certain way because it's very important for us to feed, fight, flee, and reproduce. But, I mean, what if there are higher logics? Or, what if logic is just a data compression tool for human beings? Why would God be subject to something like that?
Later bring it about that another war is the First World War. There are obvious logical limitations.
Does that therefore limit the perfect freedom?
No, because the perfect freedom is freedom to do only what is logically possible.
I don't get that. God is only free to do what is logically possible, but isn't logic itself kind of, I mean, and maybe this is the fundamental question. I mean, guys, I'm by no means an expert logician, but is the idea that logic is something discovered, that we discovered logic in the universe? And it's like, okay, well, the universe is obedient to these laws. Or do we find ourselves with concepts which are reflections of our own limitations? Concepts like logic, concepts like, human rationality, even colors, tastes, all of these are reflections of human limitations. Why would the reflections of human limitations have any consequence on God's limitations, right? Doesn't the Bible say his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts?
Perfect freedom is freedom to do only what is logically possible. And in virtue of not being subject to irrational inclinations, he will always inevitably do the best.
What about the creation of the universe? Was God perfectly free to either create or not create this universe?
Goodness spreads itself. There would be something wrong with a solitary divine being all by himself. How could he be perfectly good unless he was concerned to bring about more goodness?
How could he be perfectly good if he wasn't concerned to bring about more goodness? But if he was concerned and if he desired to bring about more goodness, wouldn't that desire lead to the fact that he wasn't fulfilled in that way? And if God is not fulfilled, then how is he the best conceivable being? Because the highest conceivable being is one that doesn't have any desires. I don't know. I mean, this is messy. Please leave it in the comments if you think that I've missed something, especially, because I'm pretty sure that I did miss something. Anyway, I want to keep going. I want to watch the rest of this episode. Tell me who we should look at next as it pertains to how free is God. Thanks for your correspondence.